So apparently this is very haunted because back in the olden days people were killed here. Next to God's house. And here's a mural next to a very busy road. Lovely. And here is a wooden sculpture from the 1990s. Looks like something would be made out of stone in the Eastern Bloc. This is also a memorial to all the dead people and what they did. Now there's a good chance that most of the people that live here haven't got a fucking clue what this is about. So let me enlighten them and you. There's not even a plaque at the bottom explaining what it's about, so you can't really expect people to know what it is unless they look it up, like I did. Yes, back in the olden days, the very olden days, the normal people, like us, were getting a little bit annoyed with the overlords, pretty much like now. Now, is this a cautionary tale? It may well be, given what we've seen over the last couple of years. But we need to go way back before the internet even existed, so people couldn't get caught as easily. However, there were always spies everywhere. So, let's go back to the 14th century and find out what happened across England. Ah, the good old days. In the summer of 1381, England became closer to social collapse than ever before, not since the Norman conquest. Not through foreign interference like we have now, or feuds between the nobles, but through the collective anger of the peasants, also known as us, who decided that the world they were living in was no longer tolerable. So what followed became known as the Peasants' Revolt. But that name disguises its scale, the violence and the organisation. It also hides where the revolt truly ended. Not in London, but here in Norfolk, and more specifically, it ended here in North Walsham. To understand 1381, we have to step back more than 30 years. The Black Death tore through England between 1348 and 1350. Entire families disappeared, whole villages were left half empty. The feudal system, dependent on abundant labour, was destabilised. For those that survived, something changed. Work was suddenly negotiable, wages rose and labourers moved to where they were needed most. For landowners, this was a crisis, so of course Parliament, as ever, responded with law. The Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to reverse reality, fixing wages, criminalising movement and punishing refusal to work, which, let's be fair, wouldn't be a bad thing nowadays. But it failed and resentment grew, and also at the same time England was part of a much larger war. By the late 14th century, the 100 Years' War was draining money and morale. However, victories were rare, but costs were constant. So of course, what do? They bring in more taxation. Oy vey. In 1377, the Crown introduced a poll tax, the same amount paid by every adult regardless of their wealth. How nice. But then in 1379 they thought, we've not done enough, we'll increase it. And then in 1381 they did another one again. The final tax was enforced with exceptional aggression. Again, a bit like now. Collectors entered homes, they questioned ages, and they humiliated families. For many, this was when grievance was going to turn into action. In late May 1381, villagers in Fobb in Essex refused to pay. Officials were assaulted and driven out. Resistance spread rapidly, not randomly, but along roads, markets and shared grievances. Prisons were broken open, court rolls were destroyed, and debts were symbolically erased. This was not mindless violence. it was targeted. The revolt wasn't only carried out by men, and court records do tell a different story. Women marched, women destroyed records, and while this isn't in any way anything to do with feminism, the women named officials, and because some men do like to listen to women, they incited the crowds. The women were taxed, fined and punished. But there was one woman in Essex called Joanna Ferrell, here played by someone completely different. She was active in London during the height of the revolt. She helped organise attacks on royal property. She was involved in the execution of the Archbishop Simon Sudbury. She was later arrested and tried. Chroniclers didn't know how to explain her, and that discomfort tells us how her real power was. By mid-June, tens of thousands of rebels entered London. The city didn't resist. Gates were opened from within. Symbols of authority were destroyed, legal records, palaces and tax offices. The rebels demanded freedom from serfdom, fair rents and the removal of corrupt officials. The good old days, if only we could do that now. Legally, of course. On the 14th of June, King Richard II met them at Mile End. He promised reform. The next day, Wat Tyler was killed, and within days, the revolt in London dissolved. And to the surprise of no one, King Richard II's promises were withdrawn. He was lying all along, just to shut them up. Now, what followed in East Anglia was different. Whereas London had given up the ghost under false promises, things were done a little bit differently around here. It intensified. Norfolk and Suffolk were the worst of the bunch. They were the most densely populated parts of the country, and also the most economically active. The labour laws hit harder here, and so did the poll tax, and naturally, they got a lot more pissed off than they did in London. Norwich in 1381 was one of the largest cities in England. It was wealthy, commercially active and deeply unequal. When the revolt reached Norfolk, it wasn't just a mob passing through. The city was taken. Officials were removed, records were destroyed, and authority collapsed from within again. This matters because it shows that what was happening wasn't chaos, it was a local power changing hands. At the centre of the Norfolk revolt was Geoffrey Lister, a dyer by trade, a skilled worker, and a man with influence before the days of X. Lister declared himself King of the Commons. Under his leadership, rebels coordinated actions across villages. Manorial courts were dismantled, feudal obligations were publicly rejected. And this was when it all got rather ambitious. The Crown responded with force. Henry Lyndon Spencer, the Bishop of Norwich, was not only a religious man, but he was also a soldier as well. He raised the troops and he moved them quickly. He also offered no negotiation. The revolt in East Anglia would be met with absolute violence. And this is where it ended, in a field in North Walsham. Not necessarily this field, because I don't really know, and you don't come here for complete accuracy, but you know what a field looks like and they all look the same. But it was here the rebels made their stand. They fortified it with carts, ditches, mounds, but they were poorly armed. The battle was brief. It was over very quickly. Geoffrey Lister was captured here, and he was taken outside the church to be hung, drawn and quartered as a warning to people ever trying this shit again. The rebels here knew there was going to be no negotiation. They knew it was only going to be violence, and whilst they were prepared, they were still underprepared for the brutal soldiers that took Lee in following orders. You know the types. In the months that followed, hundreds were executed, a lot were fined, and a lot were put in prison. However, the poll tax was never attempted again, well until much later on, as we well know, when things went pretty much similarly as they did here, only with less violence and death and people not being hung, drawn and quartered. And then they changed the name to council tax in a way to try and fool us into thinking it's something different. But the main thing is, fear entered the ruling class. They knew they could only push things so far before people would actually kick off and not expect it. And although they came back violently, and on this occasion here they won, it still set them on edge, which is why they didn't try any of this shit for a very long time. The Peasants' Revolt didn't win, but it did expose the limits of power. It showed that ordinary people could articulate demands and bring the country to its knees if they weren't getting their way. But it also reminds us that history doesn't always end where it began. Where it began in London, it ended here, possibly in this field, somewhere 120 miles away. Now, of course, we can't do any of this kind of shit anymore, and nor am I encouraging it. However, the more current governments try to push us, there will always be a breaking point. But whether it'll end in the kind of disaster that it did here, who's to say? Let's hope not. Let's hope it all ends through voting through the right party. As if. Anyway, that's enough of me talking to myself in a field. Until next time, ta-ta for now. It's cold. If you enjoyed that video of me walking around in a field talking to myself, you can always buy us a cuppa on Ko-fi. The link's in the description below, and thank you in advance if you do. Now, where's Ming? You don't care, do you? Because you're getting peace and quiet. Until I got home.